Alright, let's talk about one of the most fascinating, rebellious, and downright dramatic figures in English literature, Lord Byron. He wasn't just a poet, he was a full-blown legend in his own lifetime. Byron was born in 1788, and he loved to boast about his ancestry. His family could supposedly trace their line all the way back to the Norman conquest. His grandfather had been a rather notorious admiral, and his father was an extravagant rake who married a Scottish heiress, Miss Gordon, and quickly squandered her fortune. Byron's early childhood was spent in Aberdeen. That little Scottish detail has been asked in exam, and at just 10 years old he inherited both the title and his ancestral home, Newstead Abbey. He was educated at Harrow and then Cambridge. Byron had a dark, moody personality, but was also witty, affectionate, and full of charm. That mix of pride, melancholy, and passion became what we now call the Byronic temperament, and yes, that exact phrase has been asked in exam. As a child, he suffered from a deformity in his foot, something that caused him pain and insecurity all his life. After university, Byron threw himself into pleasure and wild living at Newstead, gaining a reputation as a daredevil and scandal maker. Eventually, though, he tired of it all and decided to travel. His journey across Europe inspired the poem that made him famous overnight, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. When the first cantos were published, Byron famously said, "I awoke one morning and found myself famous." The poem's hero, a melancholy young wanderer, is really Byron himself, a romantic outsider reflecting on life, love, and loss. And yes, Childe Harold and its Spenserian stanzas have been repeatedly asked in exam. But Byron didn't stop there. He poured out poetic tales one after another. The Giaour and the Bride of Abydos in 1813, The Corsair and Lara in 1814, The Siege of Corinth and Parisina in 1815. All these poems feature the classic Byronic hero, passionate, proud, haunted, and defiant. He even replaced Scott as the most popular poet of his time, though he lacked Scott's earthy vigor. Then came scandal. Byron married a wealthy heiress, but the marriage collapsed within a year. Rumors of shocking behavior, even incest, drove him out of England in 1816. He never returned. During his exile, he kept writing The Prisoner of Chillon in 1816, Beppo in 1818, and Mazeppa in 1819, each of which has been asked in exam. But Byron's greatest and most controversial work is Don Juan, written between 1819 and 1824. It's a vast satirical poem, basically a picaresque novel in verse, another key exam point. The poem follows Don Juan through one adventure after another, using humor, irony, and biting social commentary. At the time, it was denounced as immoral, but it's now considered one of the greatest English satires. The poem is written in ottava rima, that 8-line stanza with a punchy rhythm that makes it sound half colloquial, half elegant. Its tone swings from savage mockery to surprising tenderness, and it's where Byron pours out his bitterness, wit, and genius all at once. He also wrote some powerful dramatic poems while living in Italy. The best known are Manfred from 1817, Marino Faliero in 1820, The Two Foscari and Cain in 1821, and The Deformed Transformed in 1824. Each features a version of the Byronic hero, again proud, defiant, and doomed. Cain, for instance, presents the biblical figure as an outcast who dares to question divine justice. That theme has been tested in exam. The Deformed Transformed, on the other hand, mirrors Byron's own sense of physical imperfection. Byron's last act was as bold as his poetry. In 1823, he joined the Greek War of Independence, raising funds and even leading troops. He died the following year in Missolonghi from fever, a national hero in Greece and a legend in English literature. His death, his poetry, and his wild life made him the embodiment of the romantic spirit. Passionate, rebellious, and larger than life. He was handsome, scandalous, and so famous that people used to faint when he entered a room. But beyond the legend, his writing defined a whole new kind of literary hero, the Byronic hero, that dark, brooding figure who feels everything too deeply. Let's start at the beginning. Byron's first book of poetry, Hours of Idleness, came out in 1807. It's a collection of youthful poems full of romantic sentiment. But here's what's interesting. Critics absolutely tore it apart. The Edinburgh Review was so harsh that Byron fired back with a furious satire called English Bards and Scotch Reviewers in 1809, a title you'll want to remember because it's been asked in exams. This poem is written in heroic couplets, just like Pope's Dunciad, and the opening actually parodies Juvenal's first satire. Byron uses it to attack poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge while praising neoclassical masters such as Pope and Dryden. It's fiery, witty, and shows Byron's sharp critical edge. But the turning point came with Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, first published in 1812. The morning the first two cantos appeared 3rd March, to be exact. Byron famously said, "I awoke one morning and found myself famous." That quote has been directly asked in exam, so don't forget it. Now, who is Childe Harold? The word child means a young, noble, or a knight in training. But Harold is no knight in shining armor. He is weary of pleasure, disillusioned by society, and wanders across Europe searching for meaning, basically the first Byronic hero. In Canto 1, he describes the devastation of Spain and Portugal under French invasion. The scene has come up in exam. In Canto 2, he visits Greece, mourning its glorious past and lamenting its enslavement under the Turks, again exam tested. Canto 3 takes him through Waterloo, the Rhine, and the landscapes of Switzerland, where the mountains mirror his inner storm. And in Canto 4, Harold travels through Italy, grieving over its lost artistic grandeur and fallen spirit. Together, these 4 cantos capture the romantic mood of melancholy and world-weariness that defined a generation. After Childe Harold, Byron entered his most creative phase, writing one verse tale after another. The Giaour and the Bride of Abydos in 1813, The Corsair and Lara in 1814, Hebrew Melodies in 1815, and The Siege of Corinth and Parisina in 1816. Each one features a passionate, solitary hero, proud, rebellious, and doomed, the classic Byronic figure that influenced everyone from Shelley and Pushkin to Emily Bronte's Heathcliff. Byron's poetry was read, quoted, and even sung across Europe. His heroes embodied freedom, defiance, and that deep romantic melancholy that refuses to fit into society's rules. So if you ever need a quick summary for exam, Hours of Idleness, his first book, 1807. English Bards and Scotch Reviewers, his angry satire. Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, his masterpiece and rise to fame. And all those verse tales, the Giaour, the Corsair, Lara, Parisina, that made the Byronic hero a European legend. Byron didn't just write poetry, he became poetry. Alright, let's talk about one of the most exciting phases in Lord Byron's life, his years around Lake Geneva and later in Venice. Between 1816 and 1818, this short period gave us some of his best work, and trust me, almost every piece from here has been asked in exam. Let's start with The Prisoner of Chillon, written in 1816. It's a long narrative poem, 392 lines to be exact, and yes, that number has been asked in exam. Byron wrote it after visiting the Chateau de Chillon on Lake Geneva with his friend Percy Bysshe Shelley on the 22nd of June 1816. They toured the castle's dungeons, where Byron heard the story of Francois Bonivard, a Genoa monk imprisoned there between 1532 and 1536, another exam favorite. Because of heavy rain, Byron ended up stuck in the nearby town of Ouchy, and while waiting out the storm, he wrote this poem. The Prisoner of Chillon tells the story of a man enduring terrible suffering in isolation. His father is burnt at the stake, 2 brothers die in battle, another is executed, and he is left alone to survive in chains. It's classic Byron, tragic, solitary, and defiant. Even in the darkness, He finds comfort in nature's beauty, light, air, and freedom of spirit. Byron finished the poem around the 2nd of July, 1816, and published it in December that same year. That summer also gave us The Dream, Prometheus, and Darkness, all from 1816 poems, exploring inner struggle, hope, and the limits of human endurance. Then came Manfred, written between late 1816 and early 1817. It's what Byron called a closet drama, meaning it was written to be read, not performed. The story is soaked in supernatural imagery, spirits, destinies, and guilt, very much inspired by those ghost story sessions Byron, Shelley, and Mary Shelley shared by the lake that summer. Manfred is a perfect example of Gothic Romanticism. Later, composers like Robert Schumann and Tchaikovsky turned it into music. And even Nietzsche wrote a piece called Manfred Meditation. That's how influential it became. Next comes The Lament of Tasso, written in 1817, another poem about a misunderstood genius imprisoned by the world, echoing Byron's fascination with freedom and suffering. But by the time he moved to Venice, his tone changed completely. In 1818, Byron wrote Beppo, a Venetian story, and this one is pure wit and mischief. It's written in ottava rima, an Italian verse form Byron later perfected in Don Juan. The poem has 760 lines across 95 stanzas, and yes, that's been asked in exam. The story is charmingly scandalous. Laura's husband, Beppo, goes missing. Believing him dead, she takes a cavalier servante, basically a polite lover, as was the Venetian custom. During carnival, she notices a mysterious Turk watching her. Turns out it's Beppo himself, back from captivity as a pirate and slave. In true Byron style, instead of a tragic ending, the story ends with humor and reconciliation. Laura rejoins Beppo and everyone becomes friends. So, these years from The Prisoner of Chillon to Manfred and Beppo mark Byron's transformation. He moves from dark romantic isolation to witty social satire, from the suffering hero to the sharp observer, and it's exactly this duality that keeps Byron one of the most fascinating poets of his age and one who always finds his way into the exam paper. Alright, let's talk about Lord Byron, the bad boy of romantic poetry. His masterpiece Don Juan is a must-know for exam. It's a satirical epic poem that Byron worked on between 1819 and 1824. At his death, he had finished 16 cantos, and the story runs for more than 16,000 lines. And yes, both of those details have been asked in exam. Now, Don Juan isn't your typical hero. In Byron's version, he's not the womanizer we expect. He's actually the one constantly being seduced. The poem is written in ottava rima, 8-line stanzas, with a witty rhyming couplet at the end. This form lets Byron switch easily between humor and seriousness, and the use of ottava rima for satire has been directly tested in exam. Byron based his hero on the old Spanish legend of Don Juan, and that origin has also come up in exam. The poem first appeared in 1819, and the first 2 cantos scandalized readers. Critics said it was immoral. Byron probably smiled at that because he loved provoking people. The story starts in Spain. Don Juan grows up with quarreling parents, inherits a fortune, and has an affair with Julia, a married woman. When her husband finds out, Juan is forced to flee. That exile and affair have both been asked in exam. On his voyage, his ship wrecks in the Mediterranean and he barely survives. He is rescued by Haide, the beautiful daughter of a pirate, and the two fall in love. But the reunion doesn't last. Her father returns, sells Juan into slavery, and he is bought by a Turkish princess, another exam highlight. Juan later escapes when the Russians attack the Turks. He becomes a war hero. Catherine the Great herself falls for him and even sends him to England as her ambassador. There, Byron turns his wit on the English aristocracy, mocking their manners and hypocrisy. The poem ends mid-story with Juan probably about to seduce another woman. Because, of course, Byron died in 1824 before finishing it. One more detail examiners love. Byron cheekily dedicated Don Juan to Robert Southey, who was the poet laureate at the time. The dedication isn't flattering, it's savage. In stanza 3, he calls him Bob and teases him for trying too hard to be England's only poetic blackbird. That whole mocking stanza has been quoted in exam, so it's worth remembering. Now, Byron's creative streak around this time was wild. In 1819 alone, he wrote Mazeppa, a long narrative poem about a 17th century Ukrainian leader and the prophecy of Dante. That same year, he also penned fragment of a novel sometimes called The Burial, a Fragment. This unfinished story features a mysterious character named Augustus Darvell and is one of the first vampire tales in English. Fun fact, Byron's doctor, John William Polidori, took that fragment and expanded it into The Vampire 1819, which was at first wrongly credited to Byron himself. Moving into the early 1820s, Byron turned to drama. In Sardanapalus and The Two Foscari, both from 1821, he explores tragic history. Marino Faliero came slightly earlier in 1820, also a tragedy. Around the same time, he wrote Cain, a dramatic poem retelling the biblical story of Cain as a rebel questioning God's justice. And yes, that theme of rebellion and free will has been asked in exam. He didn't stop there. 1821 also gave us The Vision of Judgment, his satirical reply to Southey's own poem, and Heaven and Earth. Then came Werner, 1822, The Age of Bronze, 1823, The Island, 1823, and The Deformed Transformed, 1824. After his death, his letters and journals were published in 1830, offering glimpses into the wild, witty personality behind the poems. So in short, Don Juan is Byron at his boldest, playful, scandalous, and endlessly ironic. The later works show how far he stretched himself, from political satire to drama, from war to vampires. But whatever he wrote, it always carried that unmistakable Byronic flair, wit, rebellion, and emotional fire, and nearly every title here has been asked in exam. Alright, let's dive into two of Byron's most personal and widely read poems. First up, She Walks in Beauty. Written in 1814, and yes, that date has been asked in exam more than once. The poem was actually inspired by a real-life moment. On the evening of June 11, 1814, Byron attended a party in London. There he saw Mrs. Anne Beatrix Wilmot, his cousin's wife, dressed in a stunning black gown that glittered with sequins. Her quiet elegance struck him so much that he wrote this poem the very next day. That origin story, the real event behind the poem, has been highlighted in exam. Now listen to how the poem opens. She walks in beauty like the night, of cloudless climes and starry skies. So something you. These opening lines have been asked in exam, and they're some of the most famous in all of Romantic poetry. Notice what Byron does here. Instead of comparing beauty to the brightness of day, he compares it to the calm of night. It's soft, serene, and full of harmony. The first stanza celebrates this perfect balance between light and dark, all that's best of dark and bright, meet in her aspect and her eyes. He says even one shade more or one ray less would spoil the delicate harmony of her beauty. But as the poem moves forward, the focus shifts from her appearance to her character. The final stanza praises not just her outward grace, but her inner peace. A mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. That line too, a heart whose love is innocent, is a favorite in exam questions. So, She Walks in Beauty isn't a love poem in the typical sense. It's admiration from a distance, an ode to inner calm and outward grace. Byron sees beauty as a reflection of purity, not desire. Now, just 2 years later, we get a very different Byron, more raw, more emotional in When We Two Parted 1816. This one's been directly asked in exam as well. Here, Byron writes about heartbreak and silence after a secret love affair ends. It opens quietly, almost whispering. When we two parted, in silence and tears. Those first lines have appeared in exam. and they set the tone perfectly, quiet, restrained pain. The speaker feels betrayed, remembering how his lover's cheek grew pale, how her kiss went cold. He even says, "Thy vows are all broken, and light is thy fame," suggesting that she has been unfaithful and now carries a ruined reputation. Later in the poem, he describes the pain of hearing her name spoken in public, "a knell to mine ear." That line captures the haunting quality of memory. He grieves in secret, saying, "They know not I knew thee, who knew thee too well." The heartbreak here is personal, private, and lifelong. The final lines bring the poem full circle. Final, "If I should meet thee after long years, how should I greet thee? With silence and tears." These closing words, again asked in exams, show that nothing has healed. The emotion is frozen in time. Together, these two poems show Byron's range. She walks in beauty, glows with admiration and serenity, while When We Two Parted bleeds with quiet sorrow. One celebrates idealized beauty, the other mourns lost love, and both capture that romantic fascination with emotion, intense, personal, and unforgettable.